The number of Chinese students going abroad for education has steadily increased in recent decades, but the average age of those students is getting younger every year. Why are Chinese parents sending their children to foreign universities earlier? After years of domestic education, students going overseas have to deal with a brand new academic perspective. They deal with the culture shock when faced with a new environment. And what are the main difficulties for them settling in another country? The year 2017 is set to see the largest ever number of Chinese returnees, and coming back to China is still the #1 choice for Chinese overseas students. Why did they decide to come back for their career after graduation? And do overseas students have the competitive advantage they expect? China has initiated the recruitment program of global experts, known as the 1,000 Talents Plan, designed to bring top overseas talent to China in the next 5 to 10 years. Are its features attractive enough for overseas students starting their life back home?
The overseas study fever, which has lasted for nearly a decade for Chinese students, is now getting cooler. However, the age of the students who go abroad for education is becoming younger every year. Meanwhile, a majority of Chinese overseas students continue to decide to come back to China for their career after graduation. The year 2017 is expected to see the biggest ever return tide of overseas students. So do they still represent an elite of Chinese students? What differences will they bring as they return home? And how is the landscape of educational possibilities changing for Chinese students today? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Li Jingzhao from Beijing Foreign Studies University, Cui Xinshu, a JD law student at Harvard University, and Flora Liu, founder of Joyview Education. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pando. So, ladies, let's get a discussion started. I'd like to start with you, Xinshu. How long have you been staying in the United States now?
I've been there for 6 years so far. So I went to the U.S. the first time when I was for college. That was 6 years ago. And then after I graduated from college at Duke University, I went on to law school. And now I'm a rising third-year law student at Harvard University.
So have you started planning a career?
Kind of. So right now I already have a job offer landed in the United States at a law firm. So I guess the short-term plan is to stay there for a short period of time practicing law and then come back to China.
A short period of time?
Well, I guess a few years in the very least. That is the hope, because my thought is that I have spent quite a long time studying in the U.S., but then my understanding and what I've learned have been exclusively limited in a college, university setting. So I think it's very useful. It would be more useful for me to get more practical experience by actually working in the U.S. And then hopefully by the time I come back, I can bring back more useful things.
But there is a very realistic question. China and the United States have different systems of law, have different legal systems. How do you position yourself if you return to China? How do you position your role?
Well, one thing for certain is that hopefully I will be taking advantage of my education background in the U.S., which is bring back what I've learned about my understanding about the U.S. legal system. And I think that would be, I'm actually quite positive about that, because even though the legal system in the U.S. and China are very different, but right now there has been so many business transactions going on between U.S. and China, and now we have already seen so many transactions, like Chinese companies acquiring U.S. companies, Chinese company going public in the U.S. And my hope is actually to become a litigator, and then there are also now more and more Chinese companies involved in lawsuits in the U.S. and vice versa as well. And as a matter of fact, when I interviewed for the job offer I currently have, the partner I was talking to was actually told me, because I was actually not so sure about this as well, but he actually told me that my background, my understanding of Chinese culture, and my kind of a U.S. and dual U.S.-China education background is actually going to be very useful, even in a litigation setting in the future.
Right, so this leads to a very curious question, Flora. Choice of major when you want to study abroad. What are the hottest majors nowadays for prospective students?
When I went to the States, I chose marketing because it's one of the hottest majors. Others include
Tell us the big
finance.
picture here. Tell us the big picture here for Chinese students who
Yes.
want to study abroad.
So
now.
others including engineering, especially electronic engineering. Law definitely is one of the hottest, and business and administration in general, and I would say computer science.
And Professor, how do you make of these choices of majors? Do you think they're based purely on personal interest, or there's a socio-economic context for that?
Well, actually, Asian students studying abroad, especially in the United States, tend to focus on what we call STEM majors: science, technology, engineering, and math including computer science. So American educators have noticed this trend that Asian students tend to focus on these fields, focus on the fields that specialize in technology and very specific skills, very specific professionals.
Right, so let's get back to you, Xinshu. You said your personal focus would be litigation. What if it's litigation against China or a given Chinese company? How do you position yourself?
You mean like a U.S. company
Yes,
suing a Chinese company?
If you work for a U.S. law firm, you represent U.S. interest against a Chinese company or China.
Actually, I would not actually agree with the context of this
A
question.
question of loyalty.
Well,
No, it's not about a question of logic. It's a purely professionalism-based question.
Actually, I think there's a common misunderstanding about what lawyers do in a U.S. law firm when the business involves cross-border litigation. Actually, like for instance, the law firm I've been working at this summer, actually we have clients that are actually Chinese companies being sued in the U.S. So unlike the common misunderstanding, the U.S. law firm is only going to represent U.S. companies. It actually represented a lot of Chinese companies as well.
Right, so let's go back to your study experience in the U.S. What would you say that changed your mindset the most during your experience in the U.S.?
What changed my mindset the most? I would say, actually, one thing that changed me the most is actually just purely from my academic experience is actually how the U.S. college education focus on humanities and social science. I agree with Professor Lee that right now, I guess in general, and especially in the past, Chinese students have actually, like Asian students, I would say in general, have been more focused on studying the so-called STEM majors like engineering, science, math, things like that. But in recent years, more and more Chinese students, like myself included, went to the U.S. specifically because they like the liberal art education, focus on readings and writings and humanities, social science like history and art. And right now, I've seen more and more Chinese students studying that and going into different areas of career, in terms of careers after graduation, like going into law, going into finance, going into different broader sectors across economy and society.
So you went to the United States at a very young age. Have you experienced any kind of cultural shock?
Well, for me personally, I didn't experience as much culture shock as I have expected, partly because I have spent a lot of time when I was in middle school studying like English and like getting myself acquainted with U.S. culture. But one thing I guess kind of not really shocks me, but kind of has been an obstacle for me was actually the focus of was actually how American education focused on participation and on expression. Like for instance, a lot of the classes I've attended in college actually require students to speak up, and actually not just to attend class, but actually to actively participate. And by participation, that means to actively engage in conversations with the fellow students and professors. And I myself actually didn't really quite understand the meaning of participation. I thought it was just to be there every time and to like speak up occasionally when the professor throws out a question, and like there were actually a few times when I received my midterm grades on participation. It was actually kind of a B grade, and I was very shocked because I was there every time. And I went to see the professors and asked them how I could improve, and they told me that it was not because I got the grades, because I wasn't participating enough. So that's kind of one thing that I wasn't really expecting when I first went to the U.S. That's also something that I have actively worked on.
So have things changed through your year's experience, and what about your Chinese classmates?
Well, I would say one thing that not just Chinese classmates, I guess, Asian classmates in general, according to my observation, one thing they tend to do is to be more conserved and speak up less in class. And but nowadays it's definitely improving, especially like I said, more and more students are now taking courses in humanities and social science, which traditionally, compared with like traditional science and engineer classes, which are larger in sizes and more lecture-based, like social science and humanity classes tend to be smaller. Lots of them are seminars, which involve a very few students and more participation, more communication back and forth with the professor. And more students are now taking those kind of courses, and consciously or unconsciously, they're improving this aspect as well.
So I think this is more about a studying style and compatibility with a given local culture, right, Flora? Is this a common, I wouldn't say it's a problem, but is this a common phenomenon for Chinese students who study abroad?
It is a common phenomenon for Chinese students who study abroad, because in China, we weren't encouraged to speak up in the classroom. We would always require to respect the teachers, listen to the teachers, but in the States, it's quite different. And I want to bring up to another point, actually compared with culture shock, counter-culture shock is what most overseas returnees are faced with right now. For example, me, when I first returned to China after I studied in the US and worked for a few years, I felt quite embarrassed when I first came to Chinese, because all my relatives are asking me, how old are you this year, and when are we getting married? Do you have any plan to buy a house in Beijing? All those questions are considered private questions, very personal questions in the United States. However, in China, it's not the case. So I guess most of the overseas returnees are also encountering, what we call counter-cultural shock. That's a bigger problem.
Yes, Professor, what do you make of this?
Yeah, I really agree with Flora, because I taught in the United States for several years, and I taught at Oberlin College, a liberal arts college, with very long tradition in Ohio for 2 years. And when I came back, I tried to encourage my students, who are all very smart, very, very capable, to speak up, to really actually participate actively in class discussion, in sharing opinions, in sharing experiences, but they are very reserved. They're not, even when I encourage them and when I think about ways to give them rewards or punishment in their classroom participation, they are still reluctant, because they feel that if they are too critical or too engaged in the discussion, they may make the other students lose face. So it's a very long process. And I also agree with Flora, the reverse culture shock is every day. And I spent 12 years in the United States, and when I came back, I always wanted to speak up. And then I was always reminded.
Here in China on Chinese students?
It's changing, but still very slowly.
And at the same time, as we just mentioned,
because the stereotypes are always there. That American education encourages individualism, encourages free flow of discussion, and very straightforward comments and opinion.
Yes,
but
let's take a look at the big
yeah.
picture here, because we just mentioned that the year 2017 will see the biggest ever return tide of Chinese overseas students. So when they get that kind of experience in the United States, when they come back to China, no matter what kind of jobs they will choose, how will they make an impact on the Chinese society?
They do have, they bring a lot of benefits, and they also have a lot of competitive edges. For instance, they are more sensitive to cross-cultural issues, and they are more capable at communication, especially interpersonal and cross-cultural communication. And they are also more adaptive, because they have experience of surviving on their own in a very foreign country and foreign culture. But there are also obstacles. They do not really fit very easily into this hierarchical, collective-oriented cultural atmosphere. So it takes time for them to readapt back to Chinese working and culture and social environment. But things are improving in China, I have to say.
Well, thank you very much, ladies. We'll continue this in a short while. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pan Zheng. Stay with us. So, ladies, let's continue this discussion. So, when you finish your study, the most realistic task is to choose a job. So, do you think China, with its fast economic development, now the world's second largest economy, is offering much more opportunities than those Western destinations of study nowadays, Flora?
I do think China has more opportunities for overseas returnees overall. When I planned to go to the U.S. for master degree, I thought I'd better stay in the United States for good because there were better opportunities there. But after I finished my studies, I realized there are so many more opportunities in China, investment opportunities, startup opportunities, and those used to be the privilege of the Silicon Valley residents. But now, if you go to Beijing, if you go to Shenzhen, you see there are incubators everywhere. That's why I came back to China to start my own business, Joyview Education, and hopefully I can use my business to help more students who want to study in the US or in Canada and eventually come back to China. In the past, we only think that opportunities exist in the other side of the earth, but now we realize China can offer all we want, and this is our home. We do not have
it's
to
homegrown, right?
Yeah, we do not have to suffer from homesickness anymore. And if we got steak at home, why would we go out for a burger, right? So just stay in China, and I guess
But this leads to another question. Are they competitive enough? Because the number of returned overseas students are increasing year by year. So that means tougher competition nowadays.
Yeah, there are tougher competitions nowadays, but I think the overseas returnees are becoming more competitive. They become more well-rounded, and they have great critical thinking abilities. They're bilingual. They have great cultural awareness. This will add to their competitiveness. And I do think that in the short term, maybe right after an overseas returnee come back to China, the entry salary level is the same. But in the long run, since they are well familiar with another culture, another language, they may be qualified for more competitive positions in an international company.
Well, Professor, at the same time, Chinese universities, China's higher education is also improving very fast, and many Chinese students now rank very high in world charts. So what do you make of this question of competitiveness between Chinese students and return overseas Chinese students?
Well, according to this year's report and research conducted by the Center for China and Globalization, which is one of the biggest think tanks in China, according to their 2017 Employment and Entrepreneurship report on Chinese returnees, only 24% of returnees are getting a higher salary than the graduates, their counterparts who graduated from domestic universities. So that means that only more than half of the students actually do not have much privilege in terms of getting their first job. But in the long run, they have more potential. Actually, according to the same report, more than half of the students who came back after studying abroad, they believe that they have more competitive and cutting-edge potentials in a matter of 1 to 5 years, and most of them think that they can get their return back in 3 to 5 years, meaning their education investment. So this poses a more competitive pressure on the domestic students. But the domestic students, they also have their advantages. For instance, they have more opportunities of doing internship during their long period of undergrad and graduate education. And they also better connected. They have they have better social and cultural capital. And
so you
they
think
also
this
have
kind of
family
two-way
ties.
pressure is
Yeah.
good for the development of China's own education and its employment market,
On
right?
the other hand, China's education is also improving. Chinese universities are bringing more PhDs graduated from top universities all over the world, and also Chinese universities are also hiring more international professors, and they also have more investment in their cross-cultural and intercollegiate programs. So the programs in China are also improving, and also several world top universities are building their campuses in China.
Well, talking about world's top universities, Xinzhu, what about those Chinese students you know in Harvard? Do they sense a kind of competition when they try to make career plans in the future?
Since competition as in China?
As they, when they return home, if they decide to return to China.
Well, I guess competition is always going to be there, right? No matter where you went to college and no matter where you are. But actually, my take on overseas returnees job market in China is actually, in my opinion, I don't really think us, the overseas returnee, and the students who had their whole education developed in China were actually imposing any competition, fair or unfair, onto each other. Because, for example, if I come back to China and look for a job at a law firm, it would be pretty unwise of me to try to compete with a graduate from a law school in China to compete with them to practice Chinese law, right? And that also wouldn't be what the firms are looking for in me. They would be looking for my understanding of the U.S. legal system, of my practice at a U.S. law firm, maybe, right? Which is also something they wouldn't be looking for in a Chinese applicant who has went to law school in China. But I do think that one thing that could contribute to the difficulties of overseas returnees looking for a job in China is actually that there might be a mismatch in expectations. And I would use an example here. So, for instance, it's pretty well known that U.S. law firms offer the highest salaries to lawyers in most major countries in the world. U.S. lawyers get paid more than British lawyers.
But in China, it's a different story,
lawyers. Right, exactly. So if I come back and look for a job at a Chinese law firm, and I expect to get the same pay I would have gotten if at a U.S. law firm, it would be foolish, because that's not how the industry works. And if I had that come back with that expectation, I would not be able to find a job.
Flora, what about the big picture? You're in the educational consultancy business. So what's the common expectation from Chinese employers nowadays toward returned overseas students?
I think they have quite high expectations. First of all, they expect that overseas returnees to speak fluent English, and they also expect them to handle the so-called guanxi in China. So what they really expect is someone who is very good at Chinese culture, dealing with guanxi and maybe alcohol culture, and also someone speak the language and understand the culture on the other side of the earth. They have high expectation. But in terms of salary, like I said before, the entry salary level of an overseas returnee versus a local graduate is no difference. But in the long run, if the overseas returnees demonstrate more resilience, adaptability, critical thinking, and better abilities in general, they probably will get promoted in the long run.
And let's get back to where we started. As we mentioned at the beginning, the age of Chinese students who study abroad is getting younger and younger. What do you make of this phenomenon?
I'm actually experiencing this change, because right now most of my clients are students under 17. The youngest student I have is a 12-year-old girl who wants to apply for 8th grade in the United States. And the reason why the students' parents send their kids to the U.S. secondary high school at such an early age is, first of all, they think they place a huge value on U.S. secondary high school education, and second of all, it gives them advantage in applying to U.S.
They're rich enough to send their kids abroad at such a...
Not necessarily rich
No?
enough. I see some parents selling their house in a big city, which is worth a lot of money, to send their kids to the United States. They're not necessarily the richest person, but their Chinese parents, I think, are the parents who place the most value on education.
What do you make of this socioeconomic phenomenon, Professor?
Education for kids, especially college education in Chinese family, is family enterprise. It's not just for personal fulfillment, personal search of their potential. Well, that's one aspect. That aspect is actually starting on the rise, but mostly it's family enterprise. So the family, many Chinese families are willing to invest all their might and all their belongings on the children's education, because the children represents the well-being of the entire family. So that's a very typical aspect of Asian culture, not just
Due to the effect of single-child policy. Our family's only hope, because they only got one kid.
We want you to get the best.
Yeah, they want to. They want me to make the
We want to
most.
try every opportunity.
Yes, to embrace all kinds of
Right.
opportunities.
So have you sensed this kind of change of age of Chinese students in the United States nowadays?
Definitely, definitely. I actually personally experience it just by flying back and forth from the U.S. to China every semester. And the first 1 or 2 years when I first went to the U.S., like people I ran into on the airplane are mostly like college students or graduate students. But nowadays, I would say like probably most of them are like high school students. So definitely there has been like a decrease in age of Chinese students in the U.S.
So if a very young student asks you nowadays, should him or her study abroad in her future, what would you suggest, and what's the reason?
I would suggest to go abroad only when you're ready.
And for what?
Ready for fully embracing and taking advantage of the education in the U.S. I see that nowadays, because lots of people think that U.S. education are better than the Chinese traditional like school system, and that is true to some extent. And then they rush to send their children abroad without actually making sure that they're ready, at least like in the very least in the language aspect, right? So then we see a lot of young Chinese
just
students
Professor
there.
Li just mentioned, it's family enterprise, right?
Yeah,
it's
it's
not
family
a pure
business.
individual choice.
Family
Thank you very much,
investment.
ladies, for your input. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Han Zheng in Beijing. Bye-bye.